Russia's biggest weakness may not be in Ukraine at all, it could be hiding inside its own borders. Think about that for a second. For years, Vladimir Putin has projected strength to the world, showing off missiles, tanks, and nuclear threats. But there's one tiny slice of land that could undo all of that bravado: Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is not just any Russian territory. It's a small enclave, cut off from the rest of Russia, wedged between Poland and Lithuania, with the Baltic Sea to the west. On the map, it looks like an outpost, almost like an island, trapped inside NATO's backyard. And right now, this enclave has become the center of a brewing storm that could ignite one of the most dangerous flashpoints in modern geopolitics. Mainstream outlets present Kaliningrad as nothing more than a strategic Russian base, home to missiles, jets, and warships. They emphasize its importance as a military hub and a point of leverage against NATO. But here's what they don't tell you. Kaliningrad is also one of Russia's greatest vulnerabilities, and after recent statements from US officials, Polish leaders, and even Donald Trump, it might be closer than ever to being dragged into the conflict. Let's break this down. General Christopher Donahue, the top US Army commander in Europe, made headlines when he suggested that Kaliningrad is an easy target for NATO. Think about the weight of those words. An American general openly stating that a Russian enclave inside Europe could be seized without much effort. That alone is enough to send alarm bells ringing in Moscow. But the story doesn't stop there. Poland, which has been one of Ukraine's strongest backers since the beginning of the war, has its own reasons to eye Kaliningrad carefully. Polish leaders have been warning about the threat coming from the enclave for years. They argue that Kaliningrad is not just a military base, but a launch pad for hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and potential provocations along the border. And then comes Donald Trump. The former US president, never shy about throwing geopolitical grenades into the mix, has repeatedly claimed that European security depends on American strength. He's even floated the idea that NATO countries should fend for themselves if they don't pay their dues. But behind those statements lies something deeper. Trump has a habit of framing Russia's weaknesses as bargaining chips. By talking about Kaliningrad, whether directly or indirectly, he's fueling speculation about whether Washington might actually consider shifting its posture in Poland and Eastern Europe. So what does all this mean? Let's zoom out. Kaliningrad covers just about 5,800 square miles. That's smaller than the state of Connecticut. For Russia, it's a military asset, yes, but also a logistical nightmare. It's surrounded by NATO members. If conflict breaks out, the enclave is exposed on all sides. Supplies would have to come either through Belarus and Lithuania, or across the Baltic Sea. In wartime, both of those routes could be cut off almost instantly. In other words, Kaliningrad is like a castle with no drawbridge. This is why some NATO strategists believe it could be seized quickly in the event of war. And that's not just idle speculation. The idea has been floating around for years in military think tanks. The so-called Suwalki Gap, a thin stretch of land between Kaliningrad and Belarus, is considered one of NATO's most vulnerable points. But flip the perspective, and it's also one of Russia's greatest weaknesses. If NATO closes that gap, Kaliningrad is cut off completely. Now imagine you're Vladimir Putin. You've invested decades in turning Kaliningrad into a fortress. You've stationed nuclear-capable missiles there. You've built naval facilities to project power into the Baltic. You've used the enclave as a symbol of Russian reach in Europe. But then you hear NATO officials casually talking about how easy it would be to take it from you. That's not just a military problem, it's a psychological one. It undermines the very image of strength that the Kremlin depends on to keep both its citizens and its allies in line, and this is where Poland comes in. Poland has been on the front lines of the Ukraine war, not directly fighting but acting as the main logistics hub for Western weapons flowing into Kyiv. The country has modernized its military, purchased US tanks and fighter jets, and doubled down on its role as NATO's Eastern Shield. But Polish leaders also remember their own history, partitioned by empires, invaded by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. For them, Kaliningrad is not just a geopolitical issue, it's a symbol of unfinished business. So when US generals or Polish officials hint that Kaliningrad is vulnerable, it's not random talk. It's part of a broader strategy to remind Moscow that NATO has options, that Russia's threats don't go unanswered. But here's the twist. While mainstream media frames this as simple deterrence, NATO showing strength, there's a much darker implication. If the war in Ukraine escalates further, Kaliningrad could become the first domino. Unlike Crimea, which is deeply tied to Russia's national narrative, Kaliningrad is geographically isolated. That makes it expendable in some ways, but also more tempting as a target. And don't forget Ukraine. Recently, Kyiv unveiled a new upgrade to one of its most powerful long-range drones, nicknamed the Round Loaf. This drone has already struck targets deep inside Russia. With its latest improvements, it can reach even further. That means Kaliningrad, despite being fortified, is not safe. Imagine the psychological blow to Moscow if Ukrainian drones started hitting a territory that most Russians barely even visit. It would shatter the illusion of invulnerability that Putin tries to sell. At this point, you might be wondering, is NATO really planning to take Kaliningrad? Not necessarily. Officially, the alliance insists it's defensive. No plans to invade, no secret plots to redraw borders. But geopolitics is rarely about what's official. It's about pressure, perception, and power plays. And right now, Kaliningrad is under a spotlight it hasn't seen in decades. History gives us some perspective. During the Cold War, Berlin was the flashpoint, a divided city, surrounded by hostile territory, symbolizing the standoff between East and West. Today, Kaliningrad could play a similar role. A small territory, heavily militarized, stuck between superpowers, and carrying the potential to spark something much larger. So what happens next? If the US does send more troops to Poland, joining the 10,000 already stationed there, the message to Russia will be loud and clear. NATO is not backing down. If Poland continues building up its border defenses near Kaliningrad, it signals to Moscow that the enclave will be watched closely. And if Ukraine's drone capabilities keep advancing, Kaliningrad becomes even more vulnerable to strikes. Put it all together, and you see why the region is on high alert. But here's the bigger question. What if this is exactly what the West wants? By forcing Russia to defend Kaliningrad, they stretch its military thin. They divide Moscow's attention between Ukraine, Belarus, and the enclave. They create pressure points that could eventually crack Putin's strategy. Of course, the danger is obvious. Push too far and you risk escalation. If Kaliningrad were attacked, Russia might treat it as an attack on its core territory, even though it's geographically separate. That could trigger a wider war, potentially even nuclear threats. And yet, the fact that leaders are talking about it at all shows how far we've come since February 2022. Back then, the idea of striking inside Russia seemed unthinkable. Now it's practically routine. So, as the headlines swirl and politicians posture, we're left with this unsettling reality. Kaliningrad is no longer just a dot on the map. It's a potential flashpoint that could reshape the entire European security order. The question is, will it remain just a threat, or will it become the next battlefield? What do you think? Is NATO playing a dangerous game of chicken with Putin? Or is this the smartest way to exploit Russia's weaknesses? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget, subscribe for more deep dives into the stories the mainstream won't tell you, because the next twist in this conflict might already be unfolding.